Good morning. Good morning, everybody, and a belated Happy New Year. It was quite a pleasure this morning to go outside and not feel like a packet of frozen peas. So I've just got a couple of things to say before we kick off. The first thing is, if you could just remember to mute your that would be great. Thank you very much. And the more important one is that we achieved our 500th member, now in fact 501, over the weekend. Is to pay a great thank you to David Smith and the effort he's put in to get to that milestone. He set a target of 500 earlier on towards the beginning of this session, and he's achieved that, so wonderful. Thank you very much. I'll now hand it over to Yvonne, who will bring us up to date with all the other things that are going on.
And just a quick update, we're now up to 502 and shortly 503, so a membership's secretary job is never done.
Good morning, everybody, and Happy New Year to anybody who hasn't said that to already. So I've got a few things to let you know about. First, on the subject of social events, Graham is planning to organise a few of those a bit later in the year. So if you've got any ideas about what you'd like to do as a social event, he'd love to hear from you. When I send this round by email, his contact details will be on there, or you can find his contact details on our website, or you can come and speak to him after the meeting. First aid training, I think I've ran this advert once before. We've had a couple of first aid training opportunities that might be of interest to some of you, particularly if you're in a more of a physical activity group. There's one at the Perth Royal Infirmary that's on the 22nd of February. And also there's a Red Cross online course that might be of interest, and again I will circulate that when I send this round, so you'll get the contact details for all of that. The Carpet Bowls group has moved its weekly cycle from weeks 2 and 4 to 1 and 3, so if you weren't available to do Carpet Bowls in weeks 2 and 4, perhaps you're available now, so give that some thought. And that's all I've got to say. I'm just now going to hand over to Philip Briers, who's a member, who wants to talk to you briefly about Vision PK and a group therein. Over to you, Philip.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. Vision PK is the local charity supporting people with a visual impairment. They've recently been involved in establishing a group of their members who are interested in meetings addressing a variety of themes, so far particularly historical themes or occasionally poetry. 1 or 2 U3A members have already volunteered to make a presentation, and I'm appealing for others who would be interested in doing this to let me know. I've sent to Yvonne a piece to go in News Roundup, which will have my contact details, and I can tell you more about the group. It meets on the second Tuesday of every month between 1:30 and 2:30, and presentations don't need to be expert and are usually about 20 minutes, half an hour. So if you are interested in helping in that way, please let me know. We could do with a few more people who are willing to come along and talk to that group, who incidentally would have difficulty from access reasons and because so many groups use PowerPoint, which is clearly not suitable for them. So that's the reason they meet separately. Maybe one day some of them will feel able to join some of the U3A groups, but in the meantime, this is a mini version of what we are. And please look for the details if you would be interested in helping. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, on to the business of the day. We're very lucky today to have with us Donna PATON, who is a local author and has written a number of books on Perthshire. And today he's going to talk to us, as you can see, about Robert Burns. I'd like to thank one of our members, David Bertie, who introduced Robert to me, to give us this opportunity of listening to him today, so close to Burns Night. So, Donald, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me here this morning to talk about Robert Burns in Perthshire. For many years I've been intrigued by the Highland Tour undertaken by Robert Burns in 1787, and sometimes felt that the connections the poet had with Perthshire, Kinross and Clackmannanshire during the late summer and autumn of that year were worthy of more detailed description and analysis. In many accounts of the tour, the Perthshire aspect is given only a brief mention, and although in reality Burns only spent a few days in our county, we should remember what he achieved in that short time in terms of preserving much of Scotland's almost forgotten traditional music and song. A few years ago, I decided to retrace the steps of Burns' visit to Perthshire at exactly the same time of year, taking photographs showing the area in its autumnal glory. And the result is this PowerPoint presentation and also the book which came out last year on virtually a little bit more detail than what you're getting today. In 1787, Robert Burns was the wonder of Edinburgh. It was a time known as the Scottish Enlightenment, and Burns, at 28 years old, had become a part of it. The first formal publication of his works, poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect, published in Kilmarnock in 1786 and paid for by subscription, had changed Burns's life. It had sprung him away from the grind of agricultural routine and made him a public figure. One of the 612 copies of the Kilmarnock edition had reached Edinburgh, where it is perceived to have some merit. Informed of this, Burns abandoned his plans for emigration to the West Indies and left instead for Edinburgh on a borrowed pony to arrange for a new edition of his poems, and arrived there on the 29th of November, 1786. Robert Burns was wined and dined by people who, almost without exception, were from a different class and background from him, such as the Duchess of Gordon and the philosopher and historian Adam Ferguson, who actually came from Logie Rate in Perthshire, at whose home he was impressed and was impressed by a 15-year-old Walter Scott. But following tours of the Scottish borders and Argyll, Burns decided to embark on a tour that was also loaded with the unresolved problems of a troubled past and the uncertainties of a doubtful future. His poems had made him a national figure, and his tours were a kind of triumphal procession. His success in Edinburgh had gone ahead of him. He was a man of the moment, but it's the nature of the moments not to last. What would be waiting for him at the end of it? For the first 2 days, his travellers rambled over the rich, fertile carses of Falkirk and Stirling, and Burns was thrilled to see the battlefield of Bannockburn. They visited the Palace of Linlithgow, and Burns was also inspired to visit Stirling Castle, and he viewed the ruined ancient hall where the Scottish kings once held their parliament. These visits to the Palace of Linlithgow and Stirling Castle fired Burns' romantic attachment to the Jacobites. James Cunningham, the 14th Earl of Glencairn, had given Burns a diamond stylus, and while overnighting in Stirling, he used it to write imprudent lines on the window pane of the inn, to express his resentment and despair that the old royal palace and the Parliament Hall had been allowed to fall into disrepair, and state his dislike of the House of Hanover, describing them as an idiot race to honour lost, who knew them best, despised them most. These verses were to cause a great offence, provoked many indignant comments. They were gleefully reported in the newspapers as evidence of Burns' lack of loyalty to the crown, and as we shall shortly hear, possibly rebounded on Burns during an early stage of the tour, with the result that he smashed the window pane during a later visit to Stirling. But the following day, Burns went on his own to visit Harveston Castle near Dollar in Clackmannanshire, the home of the advocate. Burns had hoped that the visit to Harveston would be an opportunity for him to meet up with his special friend, Margaret, or Peggy Chalmers, whom he had first met back home in Ayrshire and then several times in Edinburgh at the home of Dr. Blacklock. Margaret was not present at Harveston that Monday in August, but if Burns regretted her absence, it was more than made up for by the presence of Margaret's cousin, the beautiful Charlotte Hamilton, the younger half-sister of his friend Gavin Hamilton. Burns was certainly captivated by the beauty of Charlotte, who he later referred to as the loveliest flower on the banks of the Devon, who had once been a sweet bud on the braes of the Ayr. But more about Charlotte later. Together again on the Tuesday morning, Burns and Nicholl left Stirling and made their way into Perthshire. At Ardogh, near Braco, they viewed the site of the Roman camp. As a Latin scholar, William Nicholl was not only interested in the language, but also in anything that pertained to the Romans. He knew all the historic sites which had been occupied by the Roman armies and had the post-chase halted at Ardogh so that he could view the groundwork at that famous Roman camp. And it was here, on the banks of the River Allen, Burns was inspired to later improve upon the words of an old song, Allen Water, which appears in his works as by Allen Stream. Their onward journey took them slowly through Strathallan, over the Muir of Orkle, through Mewthel, and across the River Erne to Crieff, where they lunched. In the afternoon, Burns had an introduction to Aberachel House, 8 miles west along Strathearn, and set off in good spirits with Nicholl and wrote of a most romantically pleasant ride up the Erne to Aberachel. However, Burns also wrote of having received a cold reception at Aberachel, and they quickly returned to Crieff, where they had supper and spent the night. It's highly likely that Burns was not made welcome at Aberachel as a result of the verses which he had written earlier on that window pane in Stirling. Burns had hoped to visit Drummond Castle near Crieff during his tour, but Captain Drummond, later Lord Perth, refused to entertain him. Drummond was a recent convert from the Jacobites, and having just got back the forfeited estates of his family, resented the verses on that account. Aberachel House also belonged to the Drummonds, and few Perthshire families had suffered more by their allegiance to the Jacobite cause than the Drummonds of Strathallan in the sacrifice of life and property. From Crieff on Wednesday, the 29th of August, they journeyed through Glenalmond and the Smog Glen, where Burns viewed the alleged grave of Ossian, which is marked by a large stone on the bank of the River Amond. Ossian was a reputed Gaelic bard of the 3rd century AD who may or may not have existed. Whether he existed or not, he certainly did not write the words attributed to him. It was a James Macpherson who invented romantic epics of the Celtic past and generously attributed them to Ossian. James Macpherson was to some extent a model for what many Scots have done with their history. He made emotional claims that can't be historically justified. Perhaps the unromantic reality of a country sold for money and the promise of jobs for the boys had created a guilt most easily compensated for by falsifying the facts. And the irony of Burns paying homage there was that he was the culmination of an alternative tradition and its most spectacular fulfillment, the incarnation almost of the great democratic tradition of Scottish literature. The man who stood by Ossian's stone in the Smog Glen in Perthshire on the 29th of August 1787 was the one living poetic voice strong enough to reassert powerfully the reality of Scottish history and blow away the myths of Macpherson's Ossian. Burns and Nicholl then travelled by Amalree and over the hill by Loch Fruchi and Glenquaich to Kenmore, then known as Taymouth. And it was here, over the window piece, the chimney piece of the inn at Kenmore, after a walk round the area, that Burns scribbled the lines on the whitewashed wall, which are still preserved today. The verses are sometimes hailed as a bard's best exercise in English heroics. And standing before that fireplace on a cold autumn afternoon, and comforted by the heat of burning logs, it's not difficult to imagine Robert Burns occupying that same space and leaning against the wall to write the verses. Admiring nature in her wildest grace, these northern scenes with weary feet I trace, o'er many a winding dale and painful steep, the abodes of covered grouse and timid sheep. My savage journey, curious I pursue, till famed Breadalbin opens to my view. The meeting cliffs each deep-sunk glen divides, the woods, wild scattered, clothe their ample sides. The outstretching lake, embosomed among the hills, the eye with wonder and amazement fills. The Tay, meandering sweet in infant pride, the palace rising on its verdant side, the lawns wood-fringed in nature's native taste, the hillocks dropped in nature's careless haste. The arches striding o'er the newborn stream, the village glittering in the noontide beam. Poetic ardours in my bosom swell, lone wanderings by the hermit's mossy cell. The sweeping theatre of hanging woods and the incessant roar of headlong, tumbling floods. And the hermit's mossy cell mentioned in the poem refers to the hermit's cave beside the falls of Acharn. It was visited by Burns during his walk and can still be visited today if you're prepared to take the stiff climb up the hill from Acharn. Thursday, August 30, saw Burns and Nicholl visit Glenlyon House and then the Stone Circle at Croftmorag beside the River Lion, where Burns noted in his diary that he said prayers. They then visited Castle Mingus and they crossed the Wade Bridge into Aberfeldy, where at the Birks of Aberfeldy, Burns wrote new words for an old tune. Today, a plaque on a slab of rock marks the spot where Burns is reputed to have sat and written these lines. Now simmer blinks on flowery braes, and o'er the crystal streamlets plays. Come, let us spend some days in the Birks of Aberfeldy. The little birdies blithely sing, while o'er their heads the hazels hang, or lightly flit on wanton wing in the Birks of Aberfeldy. Bonny lassie, will ye go, will ye go, will ye go? Bonny lassie, will ye go to the Birks of Aberfeldy? Where James Macpherson had seen a monumental landscape inhabited by improbable giants, Burns saw a landscape humanized by the everyday emotions of its people. And in that sense, the Birks of Aberfeldy is an important song. It shows a vision of Burns trying to connect with the landscape of Scotland and not the misty imaginings of Macpherson's Ossian. It also demonstrates the method that Burns would later use of taking an old tune like An Empty House and repeopling it with his own words, filling it with the laughter and the grief of the present. At the Birks of Aberfeldy, Burns came closest to the real destination of his Highland tour. Later, when he was ready, the old music would be waiting for him, and he didn't have long to wait. It was waiting for him further down Strathtay at Inver near Dunkeld. The next morning, Friday 31st of August, at the hamlet of Inver, he breakfasted with his host, Dr. Alexander Stewart. Before breakfast, Burns had climbed to the top of Birnam Hill, and Burns wrote in his journal, "Walk with Mrs. Stewart to Birnam Top. Fine prospect down the Tay, Craigie Barnes Hills, the hermitage on the Bran Water with a picture of Ossian. Breakfast with Dr. Stewart." And it was then, possibly over breakfast, that Burns was introduced to Neil Gow, the famed Scots fiddler. And it was a most fortuitous meeting, for Burns was to draw many of the airs for his songs from Gow's dance tunes. Burns was also a fiddler, and although not nearly as accomplished as Gow, he was good enough to acquire a few melodies which he later used for his songs. Gow's tune, Major Graham of Inchbrakie, was the air preferred by Burns for My Love is Like a Red, Red Rose. Part of Gow's success as Scotland's best fiddler lay in the fact that he had enjoyed the patronage of 3 Dukes of Atholl. As Burns was due to visit Blair Castle, he might well have wondered if that same patronage might be extended to himself by the fourth Duke. Burns wrote in his journal of their journey up the River Tummel to Blair, the beautiful romantic nest of Fascally, and the wild grandeur of the pass of Killiecrankie. Burns would certainly have been familiar with the account of the battle fought at Killiecrankie almost 100 years earlier, on the 27th of July, 1689, between the Highlanders led by Viscount Dundee, James Graham of Claverhouse, and Anglo-Dutch troops commanded by General Hugh Mackay. By all the rules, Burns should really have had little sympathy for Viscount Dundee, who, as Bloody Clavers, was alleged to have earlier caused much brutality against the Covenanters. However, as a general in the Scottish army, he had remained loyal to the Jacobite cause, and this is how Burns now saw him. Not as a butcher of the rebel protesting Covenanters, but as a Jacobite leader fighting gallantly for James, and at the moment of his victory over the enemy, falling mortally wounded. To Burns, the stone that marked the spot where Dundee had fallen was symbolic of national defeat. But what nation was defeated? Was there indeed a Scottish nation in existence to suffer defeat or victory from an English nation? Burns had a clear answer to these questions. Catholics, Protestants, Episcopalians, Dundee was a Scottish Episcopalian, and some of nondescript faiths had all joined together to fight for the Jacobite cause and the Stuart cause. Had there been no alien race to fill the throne, he would have been as contemptuous of the Stuarts as he was of the Hanoverians and the kith and kin of the wee German lairdy. But a race outlandish did now fill the throne, and some 40 years after the defeat of the Stuart cause at Culloden, Burns felt, as his ancestors had felt, that the Stuarts were still symbolic of Scotland as a nation, and the defeat of the Stuarts had been the defeat of Scotland. Thus, standing by that stone beside the River Garry in the pass of Killiecrankie, Burns's imagination changed Graham of Claverhouse, the killer of Covenanters, into the gallant Lord Dundee, a symbol of the nation. And perhaps it was here that the Bard of PERTHSHIRE transcended his local boundaries and became the Bard of Scotland. From Killiecrankie, they continued on to Blair Castle, where they spent the next 2 days. Burns wrote of being easy and happy from the manners of the family, and visiting the Tilt and Garry rivers, the scenes around Blair, and of journeying in the company of Sir William Murray and Josiah Walker to Lochtummel and to Struan Robertson's estate at Rannoch. It was during his stay at Blair Castle that Burns met Robert Graham of Fintry, and it was through him that Burns later obtained employment in Dumfries as an exciseman. Burns was later to write that the 2 of the happiest days of his life were spent at Blair Castle, and he would have tarried there longer had it not been for William Nichol throwing a tantrum and wanting to move on. Nichol became angry because Burns had stayed here so long. He demanded that Burns leave and said he'd go on a loan if Burns stayed longer. Burns obeyed the promptings, but he was annoyed at his hasty departure, although some of the ladies, anxious for more of Burns' company, tried to delay his departure by asking the coach driver to remove a shoe from one of the horses. However, the coach driver was incorruptible and the scheme failed. Perhaps Burns would have been less annoyed if he had understood more fully the Duke's reasons for wanting him to stay. Henry Dundas, the political lieutenant in Scotland of William Pitt, was due at Blair Castle, and the Duke considered that Robert Burns was the one dainty with which he could entertain an honoured guest. So even in those days, a place like Blair Castle charged a price for admission for people like Burns. It was what you might call a tax on personal pride. And perhaps a part payment of that tax was a humble petition of brewer water. The poem was written in the form of a plea from the river brewer itself to the then Duke of Atholl to take away the bareness of the area by planting trees. And part of the poem reads, Here foaming down the skelvy rocks and twisting strength I run, there high my boiling torrent smokes while roaring o'er a linn, enjoying large each spring and well as nature gave them me. I am, although I say it myself, worth going a mile to see. Would then my noble master please to grant my highest wishes, he'll shade my banks with towering trees and bonny spreading bushes. Let lofty firs and ashes cool my lowly banks o'erspread, and view deep winding in the pool their shadows' watery bed. Although not particularly interesting in itself, the poem does offer an interesting subtext suggestive of the division in Burns between his natural pride and a position of dependency on the hospitality of the wealthy. He was perhaps realizing that success and acceptance had a price. Burns sent the poem from Inverness on 5th September 1787 to Josiah Walker, the tutor to the Duke of Athol's family. Burns had first met Walker at the home of Dr. Blacklock in Edinburgh, and it was he who arranged for these memorable few days at Blair. The noble Duke later acceded to the humble petition. Trees were thickly planted along the chasm, and the Falls of Brewer, just north of Blair Athol, are now one of Perthshire's most popular beauty spots. There's no doubt Robert Burns was responsible for changing the character of the Falls of Brewer, and one wonders what the Athol area would be like today if the poet had not felt the need to advise the 18th century laird on how to improve his property. An instance perhaps of the power of simple verse changing both attitudes and a landscape. After leaving Blair and visiting the Falls of Brewer, Burns and Nicholl crossed the county's northern boundary, and as they travelled up the River Garry to Dalnacardoch and into Inverness-shire, the hospitality of the previous 2 days must still have been uppermost in the poet's mind when he wrote, "When death's dark stream I ferry o'er, a time that surely shall come. In heaven itself I'll ask no more than just a Highland welcome." So still travelling northwards, the tour now took Burns and Nicholl out of Perthshire to Dalwhinnie, where Burns noted there was snow on the hills, 17 feet deep. Past Ruthven Barracks, onto Aviemore, Inverness. And while in the north they visited Culloden, Forres, Fauchebers, Banff, Peterhead, Stonehaven and Laurencekirk, where Burns finally met his relations. On Thursday, 13th September, they left Montrose and travelled down the east coast of Scotland to Arbroath and to Dundee, where they spent the evening. The following day, Burns and Nicholl re-entered Perthshire. Burns wrote in his journal, "Friday the 14th of September, come through the rich harvests and fine hedgerows of the Carse of Gowrie, along the romantic margin of the Grampian Hills to Perth, Castle, Huntly, Sir Stuart Threepland. And following an overnight stay in Dundee, the route to Perth would actually have been by the side of the Sidlaw Hills, not the Grampians as described by Burns, and then along the old Carse Road, the high or Braes Road, passing through Kinnaird and Fingask. It would have taken them up the washing house Bray from Glencarse and towards Perth. The mention in the journal of Sir Stuart Threepland would suggest that Burns and Nicholl may have paid a visit to Fingask House near Rate. Sir Stuart Threepland was a fervent Jacobite who had been an ardent adherent of Prince Charles Edward Stuart throughout the entire Jacobite rebellion of 1745, and his older brother David had been killed at the Battle of Preston Pans. A meeting with Sir Stuart, not long after paying homage to Viscount Dundee at Killiecrankie, would surely have appealed to Burns. While on this journey through the Carse of Gowrie, described in Burns' later song, "Yon wild mossy mountain, Gowrie's rich valley," they would have passed close to Evelett Castle, the ancient home of the Lindsay family, and the scene of the romantic story of Elizabeth Lindsay and her Highland lover. Burns collected a fragment of the song during his tour, which he sent to Johnson for the Scots Musical Museum. The complete ballad became a popular song, but was not published until 1806, 10 years after the death of Burns. "Will you gang to the Highlands, Lizzie Lindsay? Will you go to the Highlands with me? Will you gang to the Highlands, Lizzie Lindsay, my pride and my darling to be?" Their entry into Perth would have been by way of Corsey Hill, where Burns took note of the fine view, then across the River Tay, over the bridge completed only 16 years earlier in 1771 by John Smeaton. We know that Burns stayed at Croom's Tavern in the High Street with the proprietors, Mr. and Mrs. Croom, the parents of the Reverend D.M. Croom of Lauriston Place Church, Edinburgh. Burns was a magnetic centre of attraction, and it was later said by Croom to have been a most superior occasion, a rich intellectual treat, edifying and stimulating the listeners. To hear Burns talk with snatches of human portraiture of the men and women he had met on a wide stage of life, speaking with energy, his glowing eyes flashing round a circle of eager and intent admirers, it was worth much to these 18th century Perth citizens. And the minister of Lauriston Place Church in Edinburgh was proud of Robert Burns, having spent one classic night in his parents' modest but cosy Perth hostelry. Today, the site of Croom's Tavern is marked by a bronze plaque above the doorway at 186 High Street, and it was restored by the Perth Burns Club in 1992. The following morning, Robert Burns left Perth, and his journal entry reads, Saturday, 15th September, Perth, Scone Palace, Queen Mary's bed, picture of the Chevalier and his sister, a fine, fruitful, hilly, wooded country round Perth. The Tay Bridge, Castle Gowrie, leave Perth, come up Strathearn to Endermay to dine. Fine, fruitful, cultivated Strath, the scene of Bessie Bell and Mary Grey near Perth. Fine scenery on the banks of the May. Mrs. Belches, gawky, frank, affable, fond of rural sports, hunting, etc. Miss Stirling, her sister. The mention in the journal entry of Bessie Bell and Mary Grey, the two Perth maidens who built themselves a riverside bower to escape the 1645 plague, is interesting. Burns would not have had time to actually visit their grave at the Dronach on the banks of the River Armand, and so reach Invermay in time for lunch. It's more likely that Mrs. Graham of Balgowan, who Burns met at Blair Castle, and on whose estate the grave was and still is situated, related the tale, and perhaps related the old ballad to Burns. For the aforementioned letter from Josiah Walker contained the following passage. When you pay your promised visit to the Braes of PERTHSHIRE, Mr. and Mrs. Graham of Balgowan beg to have the pleasure of conducting you to the bower graves of Bessie Bell and Mary Grey. And certainly the tale of the two unfortunate girls must have left a lasting impression on the poet for him to give it a mention in his journal. And although Burns did pay the promised visit to PERTHSHIRE later in the year, there is no evidence that he managed to include a visit to the Grahams at Balgowan. At Invermay House near Fertiviat, he dined with the Belches family and visited the Birks of Invermay, the scene and title of an old song with which Burns would have been familiar. The Belches family of Invermay were also connected to another of Scotland's great literary figures because Wilhelmina Belches later had a romantic liaison with Sir Walter Scott. And indeed, Scott was a regular visitor at Invermay, where a bridge over the River May is known as Scott's Bridge. From Invermay, they would have then gone over the old Wallace Road to Kinross, where they spent the night, and Burns wrote of having reflections in a fit of the colic. The final entry in the journey of the tour is very brief, and it reads, Sunday, 16th September. Come through a cold barren country to Queensferry, dine, cross the ferry, and come to Edinburgh. Although Burns had now reached the end of his Highland tour, he was to return to PERTHSHIRE again in October of that same year, but this time on a more romantic mission. Back in Edinburgh, Burns turned once more to the business of earning a living. He toyed for a while with the two opportunities which had presented themselves to him, the development of his farming interests or to join excise as an officer. His mind was also still occupied with the task of getting William Creech, his publisher, to settle his business. But impatient after 2 weeks of waiting in Edinburgh, Burns set out on another trip on the 4th of October 1787, this time with Dr. James McKittrick Adair, the son of an Ayr doctor, as his companion. Burns and Adair's destination on this new trip was Harveston Castle, where Burns had gone for a day on his own during the early part of his tour with Nicholl. And with still fond memories of that brief visit to Harveston in late August, and with the knowledge that this time Margaret Chalmers and her cousin Charlotte Hamilton would both be present, it would have been with a happy heart and perhaps a preconceived plan that Burns returned there. Burns's relationship with these two girls is a complicated one to work out. But there is no doubt from his writings that Burns was in love with Margaret Chalmers, and it has been said that she was a girl that he really wanted to marry. In a sisterly way, Margaret was good for Burns, and it's clear that he felt at ease in her company. His letters to her are amongst his best, and she appears to have had a refining influence upon the poet. Long after Burns died, Margaret told Thomas Campbell, another poet, that Burns had proposed to her, but that she had gently turned him down. She did not give any reasons, but it's probable that she was already secretly engaged to Lewis Hay, one of the partners in an Edinburgh banking house. And it's certainly worth considering what Burns's life might have been with her, because she was a woman of charm, intelligence, and literary taste who could also sing and play the piano. And possibly, like many of the ladies whom Burns met, Peggy Chalmers was in a class above him. Burns was never known to be on sexual terms with women of a better class than himself, or with any woman who was his mental equal, although some might argue that Agnes MacLehose Clorinda, who he was to meet in December of that year, may have been an exception. Shortly before his death in 1796, Burns sent the following verses for a song, Fairest Maid on Devon's Banks, to George Thompson for his select collection of Scottish airs. And this song, so reminiscent of the days at Harveston in the Devon Valley, was his last, and the fairest maid of the song is generally believed to be Peggy, because she and Burns still remain good but platonic friends after her marriage to Lewis Hay. However, there is a school of thought that it may have been inspired by the day Burns spent in the company of Charlotte Hamilton during his solo visit in September 1787. Fairest maid on Devon banks, crystal Devon, winding Devon, wilt thou lay that frown aside and smile as thou wert wont to do? Then come thou fairest of the fair, those wanton smiles, oh, let me share, and by thy beauteous self I swear, no love but thine my heart shall know. Perhaps we'll never know to which girl that song was intended, but we do know an estrangement occurred between Burns and Charlotte Hamilton, and that she burned all the letters which had passed between her and the poet, and also many of Peggy's letters. And the words of the song do appear to suggest unrequited love. So although things had not worked out as planned for Burns at Harveston, it was a different story for his travelling companion, Dr. James Adair, who had now become smitten with Charlotte Hamilton. Adair decided to remain at Harveston to pursue a courtship of Charlotte. This let Burns make an excursion on his own, back into Perthshire and to the home of Sir William Murray at Auchtertyre near Crieff, where he stayed for several days. Murray was a cousin of Burns's friend Graham of Fintry, and as we have already heard, Burns had been in the company of both men during his stay at Blair Castle. While at Auchtertyre, Burns wrote the poem on scaring some waterfowl in Loch Turret, which he wrote as being the production of a solitary afternoon's walk from Auchtertyre House. At that time, there were no better known Perthshire families than the Murrays of Auchtertyre and the Murrays of Lintrose near Cooper Angus. Euphemia Murray, a beautiful daughter of one of the latter families and known as the Flower of Strathmore, was visiting the Murrays of Auchtertyre at the same time as Burns, and Burns was immediately taken by her beauty and by her grace. It is said that his first sighting of Miss Murray on the banks of the River Erne inspired Burns to write the verses of Blithe Was She. Blithe, blithe and merry was she but in Ben, blithe by the banks of the Erne, and blithe in Glenturret Glen. Her looks were like a flower in May, her smile was like a summer morn. She tripped by the banks of Erne, as lights a bird upon the thorn. In an attempt to woo her, Burns wrote The Flower of Strathmore, which was set to an old tune, but it has been said that Euphemia Murray was not impressed. 7 years after her meeting with Burns, Euphemia Murray married the Honourable David Smythe of Methven Castle near Perth, one of the senators of the College of Justice. So after leaving Perthshire for the final time, Burns returned to Harveston on October 20th to be reunited with James Adair, who had, in the poet's absence, become engaged to be married to Charlotte Hamilton. And after Charlotte's marriage to James Adair 2 years later, Burns sent the song The Banks of the Devon to George Thompson with the accompanying note, "These verses were composed on a charming girl, a Miss Charlotte Hamilton, who is now married to James McKittrick Adair, physician. She is the sister of my worthy friend, Gavin Hamilton." So, in February of the year after his tours, Burns married Jean Armour. The couple moved to Dumfries, and after the disaster of a farming venture at Ellisland, Robert took up the duties of an exciseman. Robert Burns died in July 1796, only 9 years after the Highland tour. The cause of his death is now well documented as terminal heart failure from bacterial endocarditis as a complication of rheumatic sea fever, which was not helped by a doctor prescribing sea bathing in the Solway Firth as a possible cure. But if Burns had not died in 1796, it's almost certain that his future would not have been in Dumfries, but back here in Perthshire. Because while working for the excise in Dumfries, his name was put forward for promotion. And it's now an established fact that if Burns had lived until January 1797, he would have been promoted, and in August of that year, he would have become the supervisor at Dunblane. His salary would have been handsome, and he would have had more free time to devote to his writing. However, we should be proud that although the visits of Robert Burns to our country were brief, we should remain grateful that these visits helped Scotland to preserve much of its language, music and traditions, and also retain its identity. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello, yes.
Thank you very much. Donald, that was incredible. What a tour de force that was. I didn't know any of this Perthshire-related context to Robert Burns. So I've got two questions. The first one is, would Burns have understood the Highland line in the way that we do, and the fact that it seems to cut through the county of Perthshire? And the second one is, which part of his Perthshire foray do you think was his absolute favourite? Which place did he really love the most?
Oh, Blair Athol.
Blair
yeah,
Athol,
round
okay.
about the Falls of Brewer, yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Don't be shy.
That was very, very interesting, thank you. But I should like to know just a little more about the lady he did eventually marry, that you mentioned towards the end.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
I greatly appreciated the talk, it was very interesting, but I should like to know a little more about the lady he did eventually marry.
Well, Jean Armour, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a book in itself, I think. The story about Jean Armour, he had twins to Jean Armour before he set off on the Highland tour. He already had family to her, but Jean Armour's father did not like Burns, and they thought he was a bit of a ne'er-do-well. But after Burns made a name for himself in Edinburgh, Jean Armour's father had second thoughts about that, and so when he returned after these tours, he returned to Ayrshire, and yes, old Mr. Armour gave the approval, and they did get married. So, and she was a loyal wife to him, and they stayed together until Burns' death. In fact, when Burns produced a child to the barmaid at the Globe Inn during their time in Dumfries, Jean Armour looked after that child as well and brought her up as her own. Yeah. So there you go.
One over here, Donald.
Thanks very much. This is totally fascinating. Save me doing the maths. What age was Robert Burns when he did this PERTHSHIRE tour?
When he was in the tour, he was 28 when he was here, yeah.
I'm interested in how did he travel? I mean, the roads were different, and did he go by carriage, or did the pair of them travel privately? How did he travel around the area?
It was a post chase, probably 2 horses, and Burns was sponsored by a very exclusive society in Edinburgh, the Caledonian Hunt, and they probably paid for that trip, because that would not be cheap to do that tour. But it was a post chase, a little carriage with probably 2 horses. In some of his other tours, he actually, when he came back the second time to Tyre, it wasn't by post chase, and he travelled on just horseback. He had his own horse.
One more.
Thank you very much. I thought that was an absolutely superb presentation and thoroughly enjoyed it. I appreciate it. I was really interested in the tour. My question is, how long did the tour take?
Sorry,
How long was he out touring on that Highland tour?
About 21 days.
Very short time.
Short time.
How many songs or poems arose from the tour?
Sorry?
How many songs or poems arose from the tour?
Well, some of them I've quoted here, but he was really collecting. This was the big thing. He was collecting old tunes, and then later on he would put his own words to them. They weren't all necessarily all written during the 21 days, but he would collect the tunes and then work on them and put words to them later on.
When you say collecting the tunes, how did that work? Did he memorise them and write them down?
He played the fiddle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he could play them there and then, but then 3 weeks later, how did he remember them?
Must have done. Yeah. He did play the fiddle. It wasn't a good fiddler like Gow, obviously, but he could knock out a tune, and he probably just had a good ear for remembering music. Yeah.
Memory.
Are we all done? Any more fine? Thank you. Oh.
Donald, thank you very much for the talk. The relationship with William Nicol, was he a long-time acquaintance, or was it just happened to be somebody in Edinburgh that he was, you'd maybe partly at the time and sort of says, will you come in this tour?
Yeah, he obviously met Nicol when he was living in Edinburgh, and they got on reasonably well. And even though somebody else accompanied Burns on the second trip, he remained good friends with Nicol. And actually, I think he called one of his children after, I think Nicol came into the name. So, yeah, they remained good friends for the rest of their life.
I think we all agree that was incredible, wasn't it? I think I know very little, being from the other side of the border. I know very little about Robert Burns, but I have to thank you, Donald, for that. I think we're very familiar with the areas in which he travelled, and clearly the next time we visit the areas, we'll visit them with a slightly different viewpoint than we've done before. And I can't thank you enough for the time that you've taken this morning to illuminate us on his time in Perthshire, and thank you very much for that. I will just say that Donald does have some books here. If you're interested in purchasing them, I'm sure he'd be delighted if you avail yourself of that. And thank you again, Donald.
Thank you very much.
It just remains for me to wish you a safe journey home and say that our next talk will be from Glentorrit Distillery. I don't know whether they bring in any along, but it's a bit early in the morning, but I'm sure that if they do, I'm sure we'll avail ourselves of that as well. Thank you very much again for your attendance. It's excellent to see all of you, and have a safe journey. Thank you very much.
Okay.